a place that you hold out as a model for the way the parts of the system are meshing with each other?
There have been a lot of movements in public health to think about healthy cities, and there's been a lot of community organizing around trying to sort of deal with some of the conditions in communities and connect that up to health. But what your question made me think of is that the folks who did this work that I mentioned in the schools in Seattle have gone on to come up with a broader kind of system they call Communities That Care that works collaboratively with different sectors in a community to use data looking at different kinds of child development and adolescent health indicators to try to say, let's do a more coordinated kind of effort and let's work collaboratively so that you can pick what works for you. And they've had some good results recently.
As the three of you were talking, I kept thinking about the famous line from Freud that the purpose of therapy is to transform abject misery into ordinary human suffering. So as a sociologist, my question is really, how do you, it's a two-part question. First, you used a lot of language about mental illness, and I kept wondering, how do you define what that is and distinguish that, and therefore are able to decide what kind of a result you've got? And I think it's important not simply sort of as a basic scientific question about labeling and categorizing, but also in terms of stigma. Because it may be that the fact that that kind of language is used is what prevents communities and especially groups who may feel that they're being stigmatized from getting on board. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I think it's very important to prevent eating disorders because the cost of any given eating disorder is quite substantial. I have started to think more about the fact that the body dissatisfaction that is rampant in our culture, even when it does not reach mental health levels or mental illness levels, however we might decide to define that in the next crosstalk session, that is, damaging, time-consuming. It costs us financially. It costs us emotionally. It prevents women and now increasingly men from being able to engage in activities that they would otherwise engage in. And we can now have direct ties to poor health behaviors and other issues. So I think. I think there is an increasing move towards recognizing that we as psychologists are not just interested in mental illness, however we choose to define it next Wednesday, but also are interested in broader issues.
There is some evidence that at least some mental disorders have contagious properties, substance abuse, eating disorders, adolescent suicide. What's your assessment of this evidence that there are contagious properties for some mental disorders, and to the extent that there is a contagious effect, how would that alter or inform strategies for effective intervention?
It is clear that environmental factors that we might think of as sort of contagious can increase the propensity for many of these disorders. And I think there is some good evidence in that. And certainly we have disorders that are clearly culture-bound. So in the case of, and I'll talk in my area with eating disorders, Keel and Klump did a really nice paper looking at the question of whether or not eating disorders are culture-bound syndromes. And what they basically concluded was that anorexia nervosa is not a culture-bound syndrome. We can find good evidence for it across time and across different cultures without the infiltration of Western ideology.
Well, I think you addressed it really well. The only thing I would add, just to emphasize as well, is that emotional distress can take a lot of different forms. And so you may have, and then there's often, at least with young people, sometimes there's this distinction made between kids who are having we call it internalizing distress and anxiety and depression, and those who act out violently. But the reality is there's often a lot of overlap within the same person. And so what form distress takes and how it gets acted out, I think, is part of that equation in terms of what are the norms and what are the scripts that are sort of ways of coping or ways of responding to distress.
Who gets treated, where do we implement treatments, which social categories are being prioritized in providing treatment. And my sense is always, I mean, I understand this is a really, really difficult problem, and it's a very touchy problem, especially when you try to talk about it vis-a-vis the general public, funding agencies, and all that. But my sense is always that when you do not talk about this problem, it will solve itself implicitly. Simply, richer people, people with better education will get better access to treatment. So I wonder, is there a way to talk about it? Is there a way to make this problem part of this debate, or is it just too difficult and touchy and we should just leave it alone?
We sometimes put a lot of resources into addressing problem areas that would resolve on their own. So the issue of PTSD came up, and it's a really fascinating example of this. So, for example, following 9/11 and other times where there have been really traumatic events that affected large proportions of the population, people with the best of intentions have swooped in to try to help. And really, the intentions were wonderful. And so something called critical incident stress debriefing was provided to many, many people. And it was an exposure-based short intervention that was designed to kind of help address the suffering. And it was, expensive to have loads and loads of providers that came in from all over the place and literally swooped in to try to provide this. And so it was a huge use of resources. The tricky part is that the evidence actually says that you're probably better off not getting it than getting it. So it's not just the case that it's not effective. And evidence is, to be honest, is mixed on this, so it's not a clear picture. But there isn't. The take-home is that there are better ways that we could be using our resources. And part of the reason for that is that we're not taking into account natural human resiliency. So there are some problem areas where people don't naturally tend to get better. And so we see an absolutely chronic course. Either it stays bad and just gets worse, or it's just waxing and waning constantly over the lifespan.
Yeah, I actually want to take that even a bit further, because 9/11 was a great example, but I have a colleague who spends a lot of time in Sri Lanka, and after the tsunami, in swooped lots of mental health providers who didn't speak the language and who actually detracted from general efforts to help the people get their feet back under them, because they now had to be taken care of because they were fumbling around in this poor country that was trying to recover from this tremendous disaster, and were actually utterly useless. But what was, and that's a real problem. I think though you can argue, if you can't speak the language and you don't know what you're doing, you're probably not going to be all that helpful. But I think what was really interesting was I got to review a paper from that same time, and I wanted to add on to your notion of social support. And one of the interesting findings in this paper, which was later published, was that people who were given tools, like to go build their house or restart their farm, showed much lower levels of onset of PTSD. I think every time that people coming from, say, I think in particular people coming from this more interest in evidence-based practice, there is often this talk about wasted resources, that whenever we implement treatments that we don't know whether or not they work, we are potentially wasting resources. Every time we implement treatments for $2 million a year or $1 billion a year that we do not have good evidence works, we know we're wasting resources. And that I would agree with you that if we don't put this question front and center and really get honest about it, then what basically happens is not only do the wealthy benefit the most from the resources, but actually we just waste resources on things that don't work.
I think part of the answer to your question is we have to be more honest that good intentions aren't enough. Mm-hmm. So we tend to reward the good intentions, and that's great. They are part of the picture, but if we are not measuring outcomes, we are not doing our job.